Reasonable doubt. 20 minutes before the jury came back, the district attorney leaned across the courtroom aisle, smiled at Marcus Bell like they were old friends, and whispered 6 words that turned Marcus's blood to ice. You should have taken the deal. If you have ever done everything right, played it clean, told the truth, and watched a powerful man try to bury you anyway because you refused to play his game, then you already know the cold that went through Marcus in that moment. Stay with me all the way to the verdict and past it, because the way Marcus turns this around is going to have you on your feet. And if you love a story where the honest man beats the corrupt one at his own game and the villain gets exactly what he deserves, hit that subscribe button right now, because this one earns every single minute. Let me take you back so you understand what kind of man they decided to destroy. Marcus Bell was 39 years old, and he was by wide agreement the best defense attorney in the city that nobody with money ever hired. He was tall and composed, with a deep, unhurried voice that made juries lean in, and a way of looking at a witness that made liars start to sweat before he'd asked a single question. He wore good suits that he pressed himself, and shoes he'd resoled twice, because Marcus Bell had not gone into law to get rich. He had gone into it because of what he'd seen growing up. He came from a hard part of a hard city, the son of a mother who worked in a hospital laundry and a father who had spent 2 years in prison for a crime Marcus had always believed and later proved to himself he did not commit. I had watched as a young man what the machinery of the justice system did to people who could not afford to fight it, how it processed the poor like cattle, how a public defender with 300 cases could give each one 9 minutes, how a plea deal offered at the right moment of terror could make an innocent person confess just to go home. He had decided before he fully understood the size of the decision that he would become the lawyer his own father never had. He put himself through college and then law school on loans and night jobs, the first in his family, and he came out the other side and did the thing that made no financial sense at all. He opened a small practice in his old neighborhood and started defending the people the system was built to grind down. He remembered the visits as a young man to see his father behind glass, remembered his mother pressing her palm to that glass, remembered the specific helplessness of a family that could not afford the one thing that might have saved them a lawyer with the time and the will to actually check. His father's public defender had been a decent man drowning under 300 other cases who had spent perhaps 9 minutes on the file that would cost a man 2 years of his life. There had been evidence Marcus would later prove that would have raised the doubt evidence no one had time to find. That was the wound at the center of Marcus Bell, and it was also the engine of him. He had promised himself standing in that visiting room that he would become the lawyer his father never had, and that he would be that lawyer for the people who, like his family, had no one. It was not ambition. It was a debt. And he paid it case after case for years. He was extraordinary at it. He won cases no one thought could be won, not with tricks, but with relentless, meticulous work, because Marcus had learned that the system's great weakness was that it counted on no one checking, and Marcus checked everything. He read every page. He tracked down every witness. He found the exculpatory evidence that overworked prosecutors had buried in discovery, the surveillance footage no one had pulled, the timeline that didn't add up. He had walked more innocent people out of the shadow of a wrongful conviction than any lawyer in the city, and he had done it on a shoestring for clients who paid him in installments or casseroles or nothing at all. He was in his neighborhood something close to a legend, and in the halls of power he was something closer to a problem, because Marcus Bell kept winning cases that a certain man needed him to lose. That man was Preston Calloway, the district attorney, and he was everything Marcus was not. Calloway was polished and photogenic and profoundly ambitious, a man who had turned the DA's office into a launching pad for a political career he had wanted since he was young enough to want anything. He came from a connected family, had gone to the right schools, and had built his rising reputation on one thing above all: his conviction rate. Calloway was tough on crime. The numbers said so, and the numbers were the whole story he told the public and the donors and the party bosses who were beginning to whisper about higher office. He was going to be attorney general, then governor, then who knew what, and the fuel for all of it was that gleaming conviction rate. The problem was that the conviction rate was in part a lie, because Calloway got those convictions not only by prosecuting the guilty, but by refusing systematically to admit when he'd caught the wrong person. His office withheld evidence. It leaned on witnesses. It offered brutal plea deals to terrified innocent people and counted the coerced confessions as wins, and it fought with everything it had any attempt to reopen the cases where it had gotten things wrong, because every exoneration was a crack in the gleaming record Calloway was riding to power. Marcus Bell, with his relentless checking and his refusal to lose, was cracking that record open one case at a time. And Preston Calloway had decided that Marcus Bell had to be stopped. Which brings us to the case that started the war and the 6 whispered words. But before I tell you what Calloway did, let me introduce you to the person who would become the most important in Marcus's life, and who was in the middle of that first case, sitting in the 3rd row of the courtroom, taking notes for a story she did not yet know would consume the next year of her life. Her name was Delia Hartman. She was 35, an investigative journalist for a scrappy nonprofit newsroom that covered the courts and the criminal justice system. And she was very good and very stubborn and very tired of watching the same injustices scroll past. She had wheat blonde hair she wore in a practical braid, keen gray eyes, and the particular skepticism of a reporter who had been lied to by enough powerful people to have stopped taking anyone's word for anything. She had grown up in a small town in the Midwest, the daughter of a country judge who had raised her on the idea that the law was a sacred thing, precisely because it was so easy to corrupt that its whole dignity depended on people watching to make sure it stayed honest. She had appointed herself one of those watchers. And she had come to Marcus Bell's courtroom because she'd been tracking a pattern in Calloway's office, a pattern of convictions that smelled wrong, and she'd heard there was a defense attorney who kept beating the odds, and she wanted to see him work. She had no idea, taking those notes, that the man at the defense table would change the entire course of her life. And Marcus had no idea that the journalist in the 3rd row would one day be the only person willing to help him prove the truth when the whole system had closed ranks against him. Here is how the war began. Marcus had taken on the case of a young man named Terrence, accused of a robbery he swore he hadn't committed. It was exactly the kind of case Calloway's office churned through: a poor defendant, a shaky eyewitness identification, enormous pressure to plead. Calloway's people offered Terrence a deal: plead guilty and take a few years, or go to trial and risk decades. Terrence, terrified, nearly took it. But Marcus, doing what Marcus did, checked everything, and he found it surveillance footage from a business across the street that placed Terrence somewhere else entirely at the time of the robbery, footage that had been in the prosecution's possession and had never been turned over to the defense. It was a clear violation, the kind of buried evidence that Marcus had built his career on finding. He walked into court, presented it, and Terrence walked free. It should have been a routine victory. But Calloway's office had buried that footage on purpose, and Marcus's discovery of it was not just an embarrassment. It was a thread that, if pulled, could unravel the whole gleaming record. Because if Marcus could prove that Calloway's office had a practice of burying evidence, then every one of those convictions became suspect, and the conviction rate that was carrying Calloway toward power became a scandal that would end him. Calloway understood this instantly. And Calloway decided that Marcus Bell was not going to pull that thread. The DA came to him personally, which was itself a kind of warning. He caught Marcus in a courthouse hallway, all warmth and smiles, and made him an offer dressed up as a courtesy. There was an opening coming, Calloway said, for a judgeship. A good one. A prestigious one, and a man of Marcus's obvious talents. Well, Calloway could make that happen, could smooth the path if Marcus were the kind of lawyer who understood how the game was played, who didn't make waves, who let old cases stay closed. It was a bribe, elegant and deniable, the offer of everything Marcus had earned and been denied in exchange for looking away. And Marcus Bell, who had gone into law because of what the system did to his father, looked at the district attorney and said quietly, "I don't want your judgeship, Preston. I want you to stop putting innocent people in prison. And I'm going to keep pulling every thread until you do." Calloway's smile had not moved when Marcus turned him down, but something behind his eyes had the flicker of a powerful man realizing that the usual tools, the flattery, the favor, the shared understanding of how the game is played, were not going to work on this one. That was the most dangerous moment, though. Marcus didn't fully grasp it then. Because Preston Calloway had built his entire life on the principle that every man has his price, and a man who genuinely has no price is not, to someone like Calloway, an inspiration. He is a threat that has to be eliminated, precisely because he proves that the whole system, Calloway believes in the system where everything and everyone can be bought, is not as total as he needs it to be. Marcus, by refusing, had not just declined a bribe, he had insulted Calloway's entire understanding of the world, and men like Calloway do not forgive that. That was the moment Calloway decided to destroy him. And Calloway, unlike Marcus, did not fight fair. Now, before I tell you how a district attorney frames an innocent defense attorney because the sheer cynicism of it will take your breath away, let me remind you to hit that subscribe button because the fight of Marcus's life is just beginning. It started small the way these things do. A bar complaint alleging vague ethical violations enough to tie Marcus up in months of process and cost him clients. Then an audit of his tiny practice's finances, fishing for anything. Then whispers in the legal community that Marcus Bell was reckless, was unethical, was a grandstander who cared more about publicity than his clients. Calloway had allies everywhere, judges he'd helped appoint, journalists. He fed stories to a whole ecosystem of people who owed him, and he turned all of it against the one lawyer who wouldn't be bought. And then came the frame. One of Marcus's clients, a man Marcus had defended and gotten acquitted, was arrested again, and this time in exchange for leniency. The man told a story that Marcus Bell had coached him to lie on the stand, had suborned perjury, had manufactured evidence. It was a lie bought and paid for the testimony of a frightened man, given exactly the incentive Calloway's office knew how to give. But it was enough. Marcus Bell, the crusading defense attorney, was charged with witness tampering and obstruction of justice, the very crimes he had spent his career exposing, turned against him. It was a masterpiece of cynicism. Calloway had taken the thing that made Marcus dangerous, his reputation for integrity, and inverted it, so that the man who'd exposed corruption was now the face of it. And here was the trap's cruelest turn. Calloway's office offered Marcus a deal. Plead guilty to a lesser charge, surrender his law license, walk away quietly, and avoid prison. The same brutal calculus Calloway inflicted on the poor every day, now aimed at the man who'd spent his life fighting it. Take the deal and lose everything but your freedom, or go to trial against the full weight of the district attorney's office and risk losing your freedom too. Marcus refused the deal. Of course he did. He would rather have gone to trial and lost than confess to a crime he didn't commit, because to do otherwise would have been to betray every client he'd ever told to hold the line. He had spent his whole career telling frightened people that a plea to a crime you didn't commit is not safety, it is surrender, that it feeds the very machine that's crushing you. He had told 100 terrified defendants to hold the line, even when holding it was the harder road. He could not now do the thing he had spent his life warning others against. Not without becoming a hypocrite. Not without proving that his whole philosophy had been a luxury he preached to others and abandoned the moment it was his own neck. So he held the line. It cost him almost everything. And so he went to trial, defending himself with the help of a few loyal friends from the defense bar against a prosecution with unlimited resources and a bought witness and a judge who owed his seat to Preston Calloway. Which brings us back to the 6 whispered words 20 minutes before the jury came back. You should have taken the deal. Calloway smiling, certain he had won, and here's the thing, he almost had. The jury came back hung, not acquitted, hung a mistrial, which meant the nightmare wasn't over. It was merely paused, and Calloway could try him again and again, bleeding him dry until something stuck. Marcus walked out of that courtroom a free man for the moment, but a ruined one, his practice destroyed by the process, his reputation in tatters, his license suspended, pending the outcome, his clients scattered, his savings gone. He had not been convicted, but he had not been cleared, and in the space between those two things, Preston Calloway had achieved most of what he wanted. The thread puller had been neutralized, the cracked record had been sealed back up, and the message had been sent to every other lawyer in the city. This is what happens if you cross me. There was a night before Delia came when Marcus came closer to breaking than he ever had. He had gone to visit one of his former clients, a young man he'd freed years before, only to learn that Calloway's people had already been sniffing around, hinting at new charges using the man's freedom as leverage against Marcus's silence. The young man wasn't angry. I was worse than angry. He was apologetic, telling Marcus maybe he should just stop, that it wasn't worth Marcus getting hurt over people like him. And that, more than any threat aimed at Marcus himself, nearly finished him, because it meant Calloway had found the one pressure Marcus couldn't bear, turning the people he'd saved into hostages. He drove home and sat in the dark, and thought for the first time in his life that maybe the game truly had always been rigged, that maybe every innocent person he'd freed had just been a temporary reprieve in a system designed to grind them down. Eventually, that maybe his whole life's work had been a man bailing out the ocean with a spoon. He nearly walked away that night not to save himself, but because he could not stand to be the reason his former clients suffered. What he did not know was that a journalist was about to knock on his door and remind him that the way you protect the people you've saved is not by surrendering, but by finally cutting off the hand that keeps reaching for them. The months that followed nearly broke him. He sat in his shuttered office surrounded by boxes of the cases he could no longer work and felt the full weight of it. He had done everything right. He had told the truth, played it clean, refused the bribe, refused the deal. And the system he had given his life to had been turned into a weapon against him by a man who would ride his gleaming lie all the way to the governor's mansion. The old darkness, the one he'd felt as a young man watching his father processed, like cattle closed over him and whispered that the game had always been rigged, that people like him were never meant to win it, that he had been a fool to believe otherwise. And then Delia Hartman knocked on his door. She had been in that courtroom for the whole trial. She had watched the bought witness, and she had watched Calloway's smile, and she had recognized with a journalist's trained eye the shape of a frame-up because Delia Hartman had spent years learning what a frame-up looked like. But she wasn't at his door for sympathy. She was at his door because of the pattern. "You don't know me," she said when he opened it. "Delia Hartman, Courthouse Review. I've been tracking Calloway's office for 2 years, and I want to tell you to your face that I don't think you coached anyone to lie. I think you got framed by a man who's building a political career on convictions that don't hold up. And I think you're the only person in this city who knows enough about how he operates to help me prove it." She held up a thick folder. "I've got a pattern. Convictions that smell wrong going back years, buried evidence, coerced pleas. What I don't have is someone who understands the machinery from the inside well enough to turn a pattern into a case. So I'm going to ask you one question, and I need the truth. Do you want to sit in this office feeling sorry for yourself while that man becomes governor, or do you want to bring him down?" Marcus looked at this woman, this stranger with a judge's daughter's fury and a certainty that matched the one he'd been carrying alone, and for the first time in months, he felt something other than the darkness. He felt the pull toward the work. "Come in," he said. "I want to be honest with you because I promised this story would earn its ending. That night was not the beginning of a romance. It was the beginning of an investigation, and the most dangerous one either of them had ever undertaken, because they were about to build a case against the most powerful law enforcement official in the city, a man who had already proven he would destroy anyone who threatened him." Delia spread her files across Marcus's desk, and Marcus, who understood the machinery of Calloway's office the way a mechanic understands an engine, began to see the patterns she'd found take on shape and meaning. The romance would come slowly forged in the long nights over case files and court records the way the truest things do. But for now, there was only the work, and the work led them step by careful step toward a truth big enough to bring a powerful man down and dangerous enough to get them both destroyed if they were wrong. The nights of that investigation became something neither of them had expected. They worked out of Marcus's shuttered office boxes of old cases stacked around them like the walls of a fort, and slowly the work became more than the work. Delia told him about the small Midwestern town where she'd grown up, about a country judge father who wore his robe like a vow, who had taught her that the law was only as honest as the people willing to watch it, and about the slow grinding disappointment of a career spent watching powerful people corrupt the thing her father had held sacred. Marcus told her things he'd told almost no one, about his father processed like cattle, about his mother folding hospital sheets to raise a lawyer, about the specific loneliness of being the best attorney in the city that nobody with money would hire, about how he had learned to expect the door to stay locked and had made a hard peace with it. They discovered they were the same animal, two people who had each decided to spend their lives keeping an eye on a system that counted on no one looking, and the long nights began to feel less like a burden and more like the first place either of them had ever fully fit. One night, Delia fell asleep at the desk over a stack of transcripts, and Marcus put his coat over her shoulders and kept reading, and understood that the thing he was fighting for had quietly grown larger than his own name. He set the thought aside because there was a powerful man to bring down, and he had learned over a lifetime of closed doors not to reach for good things until he was sure they would survive the reaching. But he noticed. He definitely noticed. There was help, too, from the people Marcus had spent a life earning. The defense bar, the underpaid, overworked lawyers who did the same thankless work he did, quietly closed ranks around him, sharing files covering his few remaining clients, refusing to believe the frame-up for a second. His old clients, the ones he'd walked out of the shadow of wrongful conviction, came forward one by one to vouch for him and to tell at last the truth about how Calloway's office had tried to break them. And the neighborhood he'd never left, the one that had made him something close to a legend, simply refused to abandon him. They filled the gallery at his hearings. They organized. They made it impossible for Calloway to disappear him quietly. Marcus had spent his career fighting for exactly these people, and now at his lowest, these people built a foundation back under him. That was the thing Calloway never understood and never could, that a man who genuinely fights for people earns a loyalty that cannot be bought, threatened, or subpoenaed away. Now here is where the story turns. So if you're rooting for them, hit that subscribe button because the case they build is going to change everything. Here is what they uncovered. Calloway's office had over years engaged in a systematic practice of withholding exculpatory evidence, coercing pleas, and in the cases that threatened his record, actively burying the truth. Delia had the pattern. Marcus knew how to prove it because he knew exactly where the bodies were buried, which cases to pull, which discovery violations to document, which coerced defendants might now with protection be willing to tell the truth. Together they began to build not a single case, but an overwhelming one, a mountain of evidence that Preston Calloway had corrupted the very office he was using as a launchpad to power. And they found the witnesses because Marcus Bell, unlike Preston Calloway, had spent his life earning the trust of exactly the people Calloway had wronged. There was a former prosecutor named Ruiz who had left Calloway's office in disgust after being ordered to bury evidence one too many times, and who had kept records because he'd suspected someday they would matter. There was a paralegal named Cheryl who had worked in the office for a decade, had watched the coercion up close, and had finally had enough. And there were the wrongfully convicted themselves, the people Calloway had ground down, some still in prison, who when Marcus came to them found that the legendary lawyer who had fought for so many was now fighting for all of them at once. But Preston Calloway was not a man who lost quietly, and when he sensed that Marcus was building something, he moved to crush him and everyone helping him. The first blow was aimed at Delia. Her scrappy newsroom received legal threats, then pressure on its funders' quiet calls, suggesting that continued harassment of the district attorney would have consequences. When she wouldn't stop, someone leaked a distorted story designed to discredit her, to paint her as an activist with a vendetta rather than a journalist with the facts. Her editor, frightened, was pressured to pull her off the story. The second blow was aimed at Marcus, and it was the worst yet. Calloway, realizing that a mistrial was no longer enough, moved to retry him, and this time to make the charges stick with new fabricated evidence. And he added a threat that was pure Calloway. He let it be known through channels that if Marcus continued his crusade, the DA's office would revisit old cases and go after Marcus's former clients, the innocent people Marcus had freed, digging up new charges, destroying the lives Marcus had spent his career saving. It was the cruelest possible pressure because it aimed not at Marcus, but at the people he had sworn to protect. Ruiz, the former prosecutor, got cold feet when the threats reached him, terrified for his own family. "I want to do the right thing," he told Marcus. "But he'll destroy me. He'll destroy all of us. Maybe it's not worth it." And Marcus, who understood exactly what it cost to stand against a man like Calloway, told him the truth. "If you back out, I'll understand and I'll never think less of you. But I have to tell you what I've learned. Calloway wins by making each of us feel alone because alone any one of us can be destroyed. Together we can't. The only way he beats us is if we let him make us afraid enough to stand apart." Ruiz thought about it for a long night, and then he stayed. So did Cheryl. So did the exonerated clients. One by one, the people Calloway had wronged decided that they would rather stand together than be safe alone. Now, here is where it all comes together. So before I give you the reckoning, let me ask you one more time. If you're on the edge of your seat, if you want to see Preston Calloway get exactly what he has earned, hit that subscribe button because it is time for the verdict that matters. Marcus and Delia understood that they could not win this inside Calloway's own jurisdiction, where his influence over judges, police, and the local press was total. They needed to take the evidence to authorities who did not answer to him, The State Attorney General's office, the Federal Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division bodies, with the power to investigate a corrupt prosecutor and no loyalty to protect him. And they needed to make it public and undeniable in the same stroke, so it could not be buried the way Calloway had buried so much. So they built the case meticulously, the way Marcus built everything, the pattern of withheld evidence documented case by case, the testimony of Ruiz and Sherrill about the office's practices, the coerced defendants willing at last to tell the truth, and crucially the frame-up of Marcus himself, which once the bought witness could be shown to have been bought, became not just Marcus's exoneration, but proof of exactly how Calloway operated. Delia reinstated the moment her editor saw the full scope of what they had prepared, the story that would break it all open. Calloway made one last move, and it was the most dangerous of all. Sensing the walls closing in, he tried to end the threat, the way powerful men do when their machinery fails them. He sent an intermediary to Marcus with a final offer, wrapped around a final threat. Full exoneration could be quietly arranged, the intermediary explained over coffee, all charges dropped, his license restored, even a generous settlement for his troubles, if Marcus would simply hand over what he had and walk away. Let the old cases stay closed, let Calloway ride off to his political future. And if Marcus refused, the intermediary said the DA would not only retry him, but would go after every former client, every colleague who'd helped him, everyone he'd ever cared about, and salt the earth so thoroughly that nothing Marcus had built would survive. It was the same brutal calculus Calloway inflicted on the poor every day, now aimed one last time at the man who'd spent his life fighting it. Marcus looked at the offer, which would have given him back everything he'd lost, and he thought about his father processed like cattle, and about the young man who'd apologized for being worth saving, and he pushed the coffee cup away. "Tell Preston I've spent my whole career telling frightened people not to take his deals," he said. "It would make me a liar to take one now. And tell him the thread doesn't stop where he cuts it. It never did. That's the whole problem with the truth." The refusal was crucially recorded because Delia had insisted Marcus wear a wire, and the attempt to buy his silence and threaten his clients became one more count in a case that was already overwhelming. The break came from the bought witness himself. The man Calloway's office had paid to lie about Marcus faced now with the choice between being the fall guy for a collapsing conspiracy or telling the truth made the only smart choice. With immunity arranged through the outside investigators, he recanted on the record and described exactly how Calloway's office had coached him, what he'd been promised, and who had promised it. The keystone of Calloway's frame-up became the keystone of his undoing. It came down all at once. The evidence went to the state and federal authorities and to a major investigative outlet at the same time. Delia's story broke on a Sunday and detonated across the state. The tough-on-crime district attorney, the rising political star, exposed as a man who had built his gleaming record on buried evidence, coerced pleas, and the framing of the one lawyer who had dared to expose him. The recanted testimony, the pattern of wrongful convictions, Ruiz and Sherrill on the record, the whole rotten architecture of it documented and beyond dispute. Preston Calloway's world collapsed with astonishing speed. His political backers fled overnight. The governorship he'd been chasing evaporated. The charges against Marcus were dismissed, and the frame-up was exposed for exactly what it was. And then the investigations turned on Calloway himself, because framing an innocent man, withholding evidence, and coercing convictions are not just abuses of power. They are crimes, and even a district attorney is not above them. He was charged, and the case against him, built by outside authorities and corroborated by his own former staff, was overwhelming. He was disbarred, removed from office, and convicted. The man who had ridden a lie toward the governor's mansion ended up on the wrong side of the system he had corrupted. The last thing Marcus ever said to him on the courthouse steps was quiet and even, "You were right, Preston. I should have taken the deal. But then so should you have. The difference is, I never offered you one, and you didn't deserve one anyway." There was a grace note in the reckoning, and it mattered. Not everyone in Calloway's orbit had been corrupt. Some had simply been afraid or fooled or too junior to fight. One of them was a young assistant district attorney named Grant, who had joined the office, idealistic, and had slowly realized what it truly was, and who had been on the verge of quitting in disgust when the scandal broke. When the investigators came, Grant did not hide. He told them everything he'd seen, and then he did something better. He stayed in the reformed office and spent his career cleaning it out from the inside, becoming exactly the kind of honest prosecutor the office had lacked. Marcus, who could have held a grudge against anyone who'd worn Calloway's colors instead, mentored him because Marcus understood that the point had never been vengeance, it had been repair. A justice system does not heal by destroying everyone who touched the wound. It heals when the honest people who were trapped inside it are finally free to do the right thing. Grant became living proof of it, but this story was never really about Calloway. Villains are just the rigged game. The story was always about the truth and the man who kept pulling the thread, because here's the part that mattered most. When Calloway's corruption was exposed, it did not just clear Marcus. It reopened every case Calloway had poisoned. The wrongfully convicted people Marcus had been fighting for, the ones ground down by the gleaming record, got their cases reviewed, and one after another, the innocent were freed. Marcus Bell, reinstated and vindicated, was at the center of it, and it became the defining work of his life. Not one exoneration, but dozens, an entire wave of justice unleashed by the collapse of one corrupt man. His law license was restored, his reputation not just repaired, but elevated, and he was offered, in a fitting irony, the very judgeship Calloway had once tried to bribe him with. He turned it down, because he had realized his place was not on the bench, but at the defense table, standing between the machinery and the people it was built to grind. Instead, he founded a legal clinic dedicated to exactly that work, and he staffed it with the people who had stood with him. Ruiz, who found redemption in fighting for the wrongly accused. Cheryl, who ran it, a generation of young lawyers who came to learn from the man who wouldn't be bought. And Delia, it grew slowly exactly the way I promised. Through all those nights over case files and court records, through the threats and the fear and the fight, something had been building between them that neither had let themselves name while there was a case to win. They were two people who had each been raised to believe the law was a sacred thing, precisely because it was so easy to corrupt two watchers, one inside the system and one outside it, and they had recognized each other from the very first night. But it was only after it was over, after the reckoning and the exonerations, when the clinic was quiet, and it was just the two of them, that Marcus finally said it. "You came to my door when everyone else had already written me off," he said. "You put your own career on the line. You helped me pull the thread all the way." He looked at her. "I've spent my whole life fighting for other people. I never expected somebody to fight this hard for me." Delia, the judge's daughter, who had appointed herself a watcher of the law, looked at him and said, "You spent your life making sure the truth had someone in its corner. Somebody had to be in yours. I just didn't expect to fall for you while I was doing it." He kissed her in the quiet clinic under the lights of the place where the fight would go on, and it felt like a verdict finally coming back the right way. They built a life together after that, two people who believed the law's whole dignity depended on someone watching to keep it honest. Delia's reporting on the Calloway scandal won every award her profession had, and she used the platform to keep watching, keep exposing, keep the powerful honest. Marcus ran his clinic for years, and it became a place that trained a generation of lawyers to do the relentless, unglamorous checking. Everything worked that had defined him, and he never once forgot the people who paid in casseroles and installments, and nothing at all. Ruiz and Cheryl became its backbone, and Marcus finally did one thing he'd waited his whole life to do. He formally reopened his own father's old case, and with the same relentless work that had freed so many others, he cleared his father's name at last. The case that had started him on the whole path closed at last on the right side of the truth. They married in a modest ceremony in his old neighborhood, and the exonerated came dozens of them, free men and women who owed Marcus their lives, and his mother, who had worked in a hospital laundry to raise a lawyer, sat in the front row and wept, and someone had hung a banner that read, in plain letters, the words that had gotten them there. "Keep pulling the thread." They tried to destroy Marcus Bell by turning his own integrity into a weapon against him, certain that a man who played it clean would have no way to fight a man who cheated. They forgot that the truth pursued relentlessly by someone who refuses to stop checking is stronger than any lie, no matter how powerful the liar. Every thread they cut, Marcus found another. Every case they buried, he dug up, and in the end he had more than his license and his cleared name. He had dozens of innocent people freed, and his own father's name restored, and a clinic that would carry the work on for decades, and a partner who had fought for the truth of him before she ever let herself love him, and the deep, unshakable knowledge that he had done everything right, refused every deal, and in the end, won anyway. The day his father's name was finally cleared, Marcus drove out to the small house where his parents had struggled to raise him, and he sat with his father, an old man now, and he laid the court order on the kitchen table, and neither of them could speak for a long time. His father had carried the weight of that conviction for a lifetime. The invisible market leaves the doors. It closes the way it teaches a man to expect the worst from the world. And now at last the record said what had always been true, not guilty. His father put his weathered hand flat on the order, the way Marcus's mother had once pressed her palm to the visiting room glass and said, "You did this? My boy did this." And Marcus, the best defense attorney in the city, that nobody with money ever hired the man they had tried to frame and break and bury, understood that every case he had ever won had been leading here to this kitchen table, to this debt finally paid. That is the story of reasonable doubt. Preston Calloway spent his career manufacturing certainty out of buried truth. In the end, the doubt he could never eliminate was the one thing he'd never accounted for: one honest man who wouldn't stop pulling the thread. Calloway had believed that certainty was something you could manufacture, that if you buried enough truth and bought enough silence, the record would simply read the way you wanted. He never understood that the truth is patient, that it waits inside the buried files and the coerced pleas and the frightened witnesses, and that all it needs is one person relentless enough to keep looking. Marcus Bell was that person. He always had been. If this story got to you, if you cheered when Calloway was convicted and smiled when Marcus finally kissed the journalist who fought for him, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button, tell me in the comments the moment that got you, and share this with someone who needs to hear that the ones who play it clean don't always lose, that the truth pursued without stopping brings down even the powerful in the end. Because it does. Because the thread always leads somewhere if you refuse to let go of it, and no amount of power can outrun a man who simply will not stop checking. The powerful count on us getting tired. The ones who never get tired are the ones who bring them down. I'll see you in the next one.